Hi, it's Butterfly. Setting up a little bit. There we go. Okay, so it's Butterfly. Thank you for coming to Flutter by. I really appreciate when you come by to visit. And I really enjoy sharing with you in comments down below. So please do, engage in some conversation, get to know each other as viewers. And I like to kind of get to know you too. So what I'm doing today is a bit of a book commentary on complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving by Pete Walker. I truly enjoyed this text. It is a good chunk. And there's no fluff in here. There's no sort of fillers in here. This is written from the perspective of basically a psychotherapist. So he calls himself a therapist, and it's very accessible language. So whether you are a therapist, a counselor in the field working with clients, or whether you are a client who enjoys reading, you have to be able to enjoy reading to get through a text like this. But it's written in an accessible language from both perspectives. So I could see this being used in a classroom quite easily. I could see this being used in sessions if you have a group of people who, who would be able to enjoy reading. you have to enjoy reading to get through this. So essentially, the table of contents is really quite detailed because it just seems like every single page has a different title, and so it goes on and on and on. But it also makes it really easy to reference the material that's inside. So if you want to kind of go back to, what was that thing he said about grieving and parents? You can definitely get to that point because the table of contents is so detailed. I'm going to kind of give a synopsis or just a few takeaway messages to give you a taste of what's in here. I think this kind of information is really important, and going through everything in detail, first of all, I'm not interested in doing that, but also it would be kind of long and tedious to listen to, and I think it's worth more going through the book itself or going online and finding when he talks about his information himself in a detailed fashion. But there are some really good takeaway items, and because I like to have things in a journal, I really like to kind of write things down myself as I'm using material and what I'm going to come back to later. I did make a couple of pages of notes and glued some botanicals on them. Of course, they're coffee stained, and that this is kind of the format that I use, right? So he talks about, first of all, what we have to understand is that complex PTSD, which is the theme of this book, is different from simple PTSD. So simple PTSD is kind of like a one-time event, and you're responding to it. So a bank robbery, presumably that's not happening every day in your life. So it's a one-time traumatic event, and you have PTSD as a result of that. If somebody yelled at you in some one-time event, that would be PTSD. However, if you are repeatedly being exposed to trauma of sorts, whether it's repeatedly the same person yelling at you or repeatedly going through a number of various traumatic events, then that becomes more of a complex PTSD. And that is what he is talking about. This is from Surviving to Thriving, so it's definitely talking about, you're talking to the client as well as talking to the counselor who may be supporting somebody who is going from surviving to thriving. To understand the person who has the complex PTSD, he very early on in the book introduces the concept of the 4 Fs. Now, I've done some cross-referencing online, and sometimes it'll be reduced to 3 Fs from various sources, but I like the fact that he includes the 4 Fs, and they are the fight, the flight, the freeze, and the one that he adds is the fawn. When a person has trauma, and he will kind of give the context that it happens in early childhood and ongoingly over the course of your developmental years, that children tend to over-gravitate or tend to really adopt response types. And essentially, it can be one or more of those 4 types of responses: fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. So if you want to kind of associate those terms with clinical terms, then the fight would be kind of like you get more aggressive when you are dealing with trauma, and that tends to be associated with a term like narcissism, which is more of the controlling, aggressive type of yeah, that kind of response. The flight would be you remove yourself, you are evasive, you want to leave. So that ends up being kind of like an obsessive compulsive, he says, an association with that clinical term. Freeze is like a deer in headlights. That's the dissociation. So there you would think that that's a flight because you're escaping in your mind, right? But it's not. There's a dissociation there. So that is the freeze response. And codependent would be the fawn. So fawning over somebody, really kind of looking at their needs before looking at your own. That gets into the sort of codependent response. So as a person is going through trauma and is developing this complex PTSD, the child growing into an adult adopts one or a combination of. Some of these things are seen in 2s or possibly 3s, but a combination of those responses. What I like that is really useful is that he does give charts, and I've actually reproduced one of these charts, you know, for myself in here. Oh, darn, you know, that's the thing. Okay, so it's on page 106 and 107, but it does show up as backwards when I have it on my tablet here. So sorry about that, but anyways, I'll try and give you the synopsis of these 2 charts that I find really important. What's key here is that as a response, as these 4 things are responses that we adopt, like how do you deal with trauma, and you don't know how to deal with it when you're a kid, so you go to these things that are basically adaptations. And are they maladaptive or are they adaptive? Well, actually they can kind of be both, because these charts, one kind of takes these 4 response types and shows how they can be positive, have positive characteristics, and the other one shows detrimental characteristics. So for instance, if you are a positive, I'll focus on positive for now. So positive fight type, that means that you're dealing with the situation with assertiveness. You can be kind of assertive. You can delineate your boundaries. You can show courage. You can show moxie. You can show leadership. It's that kind of I'm on top of my game sort of fight response. However, when it's maladaptive, that's the detrimental characteristics of the fight response would be narcissistic, explosive, controlling, enslaving, entitled, type A, bully, autocrat, demands perfection, and so on. So in this book, he has a way of developing each of those 4 responses in a way that allows me to understand myself and where I find myself in those 4 things, and also the people around me as well, because you know, we tend, like, and I've had book reviews before on this channel where I talk about narcissism, but it's kind of nice to see the flip side of narcissism, where they too are people who lived through complex trauma, and they've had their own kind of maladaptive responses to it, and they're just different from my own. So yeah, it's, I mean, and it also kind of reframes this information so that you can kind of find your way to conceptualize it and maybe work your way through it and change, you know, some choice points. I really like that a lot. There's a good understanding of how you develop and adapt to situations based on your type. So that's that. Then there's also, this is something else that I wanted to take away from reading this book. And this fancy little thing here, I know you can only see it backwards, but I find that when I'm writing stuff out in a journaling format, that it helps me to retain the information. So I'll just read this to you. These are the 14 common inner critic attacks. Now, in here, in this book, he also talks about how the critic is your kind of your parental voice in your head, the verbal sort of that voice inside your head. That is the critic telling you you're not good enough. But that is the inner critic, where you adopt that voice as your own, and you're telling yourself, oh, I can't do anything right, and you adopt it yourself. That's the inner critic. Now, the outer critic is something that's different. So it is essentially saying everybody else is not good enough and they don't measure up. So the inner critic says, I'm not good enough and I don't measure up. And the outer critic says, everybody else doesn't. Where was I have a little thing here. There we go. Cute little pussycat. And I actually wrote down on the bottom here, inner critic is the part of your mind that views you as flawed and unworthy. And the outer critic is the part of your mind that views everyone else as flawed and unworthy. So that's in this book on page 191. Okay, so the 14 common inner critic attacks that are my kind of take home that I want to read about. He further breaks those down into 14, there's 14 points, and he further breaks them down into two groups. So there's the perfectionism attacks and the endangerment attacks. So just really quickly, the perfectionism attacks is perfectionism, all or none, black or white thinking, self-hate, self-disgust, and toxic shame. Number 4 is micromanaging, worrying, obsessing and looping and over-futurizing, like predicting the future, like catastrophizing. Number 5 is unfair, devaluing, comparisons or your most perfect comparisons to your most perfect moments. Number 6 is guilt. Number 7 is shoulding. I should do this. There's that expectation that's coming from someplace. Number 8 is over productivity, workaholism, or busyholism. So just always keeping busy is also a way of kind of avoiding being in the moment. And number 9 is harsh judgment or harsh judgment of yourself or of others, or name calling, like I'm a jerk, I'm a loser. That's name calling, right? So those are kind of some of the ways that you would attack yourself, from your inner critic. Now, and they all have the kind of the main theme of perfectionism. The next grouping here of the inner critic attacks is endangerment attacks. So that is drasticizing, catastrophizing, hypochondria, basically thinking there's a lot of physical things that are wrong with you, being a hypochondriac. So let me try and get this word again. Hypochondriacizing. Okay. Number 11 is the negative focus. You focus on what's not working rather than what's working. Number 12 is time urgency. Oh, it's got to be done right now. Can't wait till later. And let things kind of happen as they do. Number 13 is disabling performance anxiety. 14 is perseverating about being attacked. So that's a preoccupation. And not terribly adaptive either. So those are just like headings. And he does develop those in his book. So that might give you a taste and you might want to kind of look at the book if you can make your way through it. It took me longer than normal to read this book, and that's because it sent me often into places in my own mind, in my own psyche, in my own personal development, in my childhood, in my growing up years. So it took a lot of time to read through it because I would find myself dissociating, essentially, daydreaming and going into these memories and then having to work it out on paper or having to kind of really think about things in a different way. So in that way, it took me a month to get through this book, which would normally have taken me maybe about a week. So food for thought, if you need to kind of go through this kind of information as a client, you may want to have somebody with you who can walk you through and help you go through those steps. It also talks about shrinking the inner critic and ways that you can dethrone the critic from its life negating point of view. So you have those critics in your mind, how to deal with that, how to challenge those ideas. So that is a real key point in this book. And then there's some other really interesting stuff, but I'm just going to give you a couple of other take-home ideas. This point here is talking about grieving the absence of parental care. Now, this can be really challenging because the grieving part, and I was really challenged by this, the grief work means you have to acknowledge that there's loss. Now, if you have a parent who has not been in your life for a very long time, for whatever reasons, that may or may not be easier for you to go through. But if you have a parent who is still integral in your life, then grieving the parent that was in your growing up years and that had those criticizing messages that caused you so much detriment, that could be really hard to sort of grieve because you need to be able to separate the parent that they once were and the parent that they are now. Perhaps they've changed, perhaps they haven't, but if they have changed, then there's that incongruency. And how do you separate yourself and make that parent accountable in your mind, in your own time, for this, or at least acknowledge that they've been that voice of criticism for you, and separate that from your relationship with your parent now. There is a phrase, little blurb here on page 223 that I found key and very helpful for me. It says here, in most cases, survivors do not have to directly anger and blame their living parents. So you do not have to necessarily really kind of direct that at your living parents. The key place to direct it is at your internalized parents, the parents from your past. So that means you go back into your mind and you would address those things with this parental information, those messages that you've had from the parent of your past. He goes more into detail about that, but you kind of get the idea that you need to be able to make some kind of a separation. Now, to further that work, then you need to kind of deal with, if you have a parent who's still in your life giving you these messages now, then you need to be able to kind of deal with that. And that's a separate plate of work that has to happen right there. First, you need to kind of be your own parent and acknowledge that you are the adult in your life and you need to reparent yourself. Oh, that's another thing that he talks about in this book at length, and he gives long descriptions and lists of messages, affirmations that you can say to yourself to reparent the messages that you give yourself. Like, did you receive the messages? I am glad that you were born. The world is a better place because you are in it. I am proud of you. Those are reparenting messages. Like, ideally, you would have had those messages from your parent, but if you haven't, then you need to become your own parent and make those changes in your thought patterns. So he talks about that. The other thing that I like about when he's separating the parent of the past, the internalized parental messages of the past with the parent today, is that it kind of gives a bit of a safe place to play where you can be kind of angry and grieve and be sad at what you did not receive when you were young. But acknowledge too that that parent was possibly also not given that adequate parenting or healthy parenting when they were young. In other words, your parent gave you only what they knew, and they can't give you what they didn't know. So if their parents gave them unhealthy messages when they were younger, then they grew up to become a parent that was not giving you the messages that you needed when you were growing up. And there's that acknowledgement, that piece of, okay, I really am still the adult in this relationship, and I acknowledge that my own adult parent is an adult child of possibly complex PTSD, and what do I need to do about that? Do I then offer the understanding and the support to that parent without, you know, kind of needing to be acknowledged myself? You need to be able to acknowledge your own path, your own kind of growing up, your own, and assert yourself, and just be okay within yourself and say, you know, my parent had limitations. I have limitations. What do I do with that now? What kind of a parent do I want to be if you're a parent? So there's a lot of that kind of introspection that happens, for me anyways, as I was reading this book. Also, he's not somebody who, the author, Pete Walker, he's not inventing this information. This is kind of like the best of everybody's book ever written on complex PTSD. So this is not like, he's not recreating, he's not inventing a wheel here, but he's putting the best of everything right here. So this is an excellent, excellent book. When he's talking about grieving the absence of parental care, he's kind of reframing and saying you need to reparent and interact with yourself more nurturingly. As my cat opens my door. So although he goes through it in detail, I'll just kind of give you the, you know, couple of highlights here. Verbal nurturance, like eager participation in multidimensional conversation. He gives you kind of examples there. Number 2 is spiritual nurturance. So you're giving yourself verbal nurturance and spiritual nurturance. Number 3 is emotional nurturance. That's basically supporting yourself on an emotional level. And 4 is physical nurturance. So you might want to acknowledge your physical well-being, your ability to nurture yourself, which is not denying yourself the sleep that you need, despite the fact that you might be, you know, it might take work to actually go up, wash your face, brush your teeth, put your pajamas on, and get into bed, you know. And if you don't kind of do those things, those self-care things, those physical and emotional and spiritual and verbal self-care things, then that becomes a detriment to yourself. So, yeah, there's a lot more to be said about that, but I'm going to leave that at that and just kind of say that this was an absolutely fantastic read. I can't say enough good things about it. You know, at the end of the book, he has what he calls toolboxes, and those are further information that you can kind of go to in your moments when you need to do some self-care. Like for instance here, toolbox number 1, suggested intentions for recovery. So number 1 would be, I want to develop a more constantly loving and accepting relationship with myself. I want an increasing capacity for self-acceptance. Number 14 would be, I want sufficient physical and monetary resources. These are all realistic things that we can do. These are intentions that we can work on. The toolbox number 2, I actually wrote and put in my journal, so it's not here. But anyways, I have, it's what he calls the human bill of rights. What you need to acknowledge that may have been kind of denied to you as a young person, but you need to acknowledge these things as a right. So 1 is, I have the right to be treated with respect. And then you need to kind of define what that respect means. Number 2 is, I have the right to say no. Somewhere in here is, here, number 6, I have the right to change my mind or my plans. So you may want to go into some kind of an encounter with somebody else, and then partway through that encounter you decide that you've changed your mind, you no longer want to go through with that. That's okay, that's your right. You can change your mind. You can decide, I no longer feel comfortable with this, and retreat without having, you know, the other person doesn't get to guilt you for that. I have the right to occasionally be childlike and immature. I have the right to grow, evolve, and prosper. So these are things that are really healthy acknowledgments, and I've written them actually twice in 2 different places. So, you know, I think it's essential for parenting as well to be able to kind of evolve to a certain point where you acknowledge that, or I acknowledge that we are flawed, we have limitations, we've learned those things, and even though those things have become part of who I am now, I acknowledge where those roots come from, and then I get to decide where I want to be. I don't always have to keep on playing the same behavioral patterns that if once I've noticed and taken note of, acknowledged those roots, I can grow like a tree and kind of branch out where I want to be. If you cannot kind of go back to those uncomfortable places, though, it becomes very difficult to kind of move on into a different place because there's a block there, right? Yeah. So, you know, in my perspective, this kind of information would really benefit all people, especially if we could teach it in schools at an age-appropriate level. So I wouldn't expect somebody in grade 4 to start reading this text. But I would anticipate that if we could, if ever I could do if ever I did decide to do a master's degree, this is kind of like what I would want to study. This is kind of what I would want to pursue, is putting this information in schools at all levels, at an age-appropriate level. Because if you don't learn these things at a young age at home, and how can you if the parent hasn't gone through this education, hasn't received it in their own living, then how can they teach it to young people, to their children? So I think that it really, as is age appropriate, should be taught. Assertiveness training should be taught. Grieving, the loss of those messages should be taught in school. More positive adaptation should be taught in school, to crisis, to negotiation, to group work, to working as a team, to resolving your own kind of personal issues, because we all have them. We all have them, and to not acknowledge them is detrimental. It turns into maladaptive behaviors that continue on into teen years and adult years, and becomes, criminal behavior. It becomes, substance abuse. It becomes financial addiction, like addiction to buying things, addiction of all kinds. It becomes inward anger towards yourself. It becomes depression and mental illness. And so I think it's rather irresponsible to not teach children in school about these psychosocial lessons. We teach history, we teach math, we teach geography, we teach... I don't use algebra, but I certainly would use and do use the social lessons that I learned from types of self-help books like this. So I think it's really costing society, and it's to not teach this in schools, honestly. And I think that there are ways to kind of make this information digestible at every grade level. So that's my 2 cents. That doesn't really relate to this book, but it does. That's my sort of 2 cents to it. Okay, so that is my book summary. I really thoroughly enjoyed this book. It's definitely something that I would want to read again, but because it's so exercising, it's one of these books that takes time for me to get through. So, food for thought. Definitely worth buying, worth your money, worth your time. Take care and have a great day. Onward and upward.